So as Sergey mentioned, this workshop is based on about making theory contributions in management research, and it is based on this essay that Rich Burton and Jay Barney and I published in SMJ 2 years ago. It was the introductory essay for an SMJ special issue on new theory and strategic management. It was called A Practical Guide for Making Theory Contributions in Strategic Management, and we wrote this essay specifically to try to help doctoral students and junior researchers who maybe didn't quite know how to make a contribution to research, to theory, how to make a contribution to theory. A lot has been written on theory that's of a very kind of philosophical nature, theoretical, general, abstract nature. And we felt that what was missing was more of a practical, concrete, specific how-to kind of essay. So this is not a what is or a why is kind of essay. It's very much a how-to kind of essay. And the other recommended reading that I suggested for this workshop was Jay Barney's excellent editor's comment in Academy of Management Review on positioning a theory paper for publication, which, once you have a theoretical contribution, really helps you to frame it and to explain it to your audience. So those are kind of the two recommended readings. Okay, so I do want to pause for a moment to say thanks. Obviously, because this was based on an SMJ special issue, I definitely want to thank the 3 SMJ co-editors at the time who gave us the opportunity to even do this special issue. That's Sendel Ethraj, Alfonso Gambardella, and Connie Helfet. So thanks very much to them. I also want to express some gratitude to my 2 co-authors on the essay, Rich Burton and Jay Barney. We also were joined in that special issue by 2 other special issue editors, Don Hambrick and Ed Zajac, and providing some overall supervision to the effort was Rich Bettis, who served as our advising editor. I also want to thank Cranfield School of Management for hosting and sponsoring today's event. And for Sergey, to also say thanks to Sergey and Ebrat for really doing the nuts and bolts organizing of today's session. Now, I don't want to have everybody scrambling to write notes from my slides. So what I'm going to do is, I think if I'm allowed to do this, I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint document, or at least a PDF version of it, on the chat window. Let me see if this works. Okay, yes. Okay, so there goes my a PDF of my slides, which you can download from the chat window. I'm also going to post two handout versions of the same set of slides, which basically are more suitable for printing. The one that I just uploaded is more suitable for viewing on a screen, but I'm also going to upload 2 versions that are more suitable for printing. This first one is for folks in the U.S. because it's on U.S. letter-sized paper format, and then the next one is for folks in Europe and elsewhere, perhaps, where they use A4 paper. So that is so you have both versions of that. Okay, good. Okay, so let me move down. So I just wanted to kind of start with an observation about theory. Now, theory is just kind of a fancy word for a kind of a speculative answer to a question that begins with why, or a question that begins with how, right? So have a question that begins with why or how, really an answer to that, any kind of speculative answer to that is a theory of some kind. And I want to emphasize that that theory is really a very important primary importance in academia, and really it's what separates us from journalists. From the perspective of journalists or practitioners, theory is not all that interesting. It's really phenomena that are the primary focus to journalists and practitioners. And to them, theories are really only useful for limited purposes, for the purpose of interpreting the meaning of phenomena, or for predicting phenomena, or for controlling phenomena. And so from their perspective, really the focus is more on the trees, not the forest. However, to academics, we're tend to be more big picture oriented. We're more interested in the generalities rather than the specifics. So for us, theory tends to be more the primary focus. And from an academic perspective, really there's limited, just as from the journalist's perspective or the practitioner's perspective, there's limited usefulness for theory. From our perspective, there's kind of limited usefulness for phenomena. Phenomena is really only useful for the scientific purpose of testing between competing theories or defining the boundary conditions on a theory, right? Maybe for some other purposes, but primarily, in the scientific enterprise, if what we're interested in is getting, big answers to big questions, if we're interested in the generalities rather than the specifics, then theory is our primary focus, and phenomena is secondary, is really useful for improving our understanding of theory. So for us, really, typically the focus is on the forest, not the trees. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, to what I'm saying on this slide. There are certainly, I'm sure, practitioners or journalists who have a deep interest in theory, and I'm definitely sure that there are academics who put phenomena first and who are really much more interested in phenomena than theory. So this is not a hard and fast rule, of course, but this is kind of a generalization that on average, journalists and practitioners are more interested in phenomena than theory, and on average, academics are kind of more interested in theory than phenomena. Okay. So Sergey was making the point in his introduction that this is an important topic for doctoral students to learn how to make contributions to theory. The expectation generally is that a dissertation will have a contribution to theory. And so there's a question here of, why don't doctoral students do more theory work? And I have a couple of speculations about this, and perhaps, so this is kind of my theory about why there's not as much theory as there should be. So I'll theorize about that, being a theorist. So I have a couple of theories here. One possible theory is, oops, I went backwards, sorry about that. Is role modeling, right? That in order to learn how to do theory, it's useful to have an advisor who does theory, right? To serve as a role model. And, there are certainly many, dissertation advisors whose careers are built on empirical contributions, whose interest is primarily in making empirical contributions, and they, maybe don't do so much theory. And so perhaps doctoral students don't get the kind of role modeling that they would need in order to really shine on the theory side. Okay, what did I do again? Okay, keep my windows correct. Okay, so another possible answer is that the job of the doctoral student really is to get a faculty position, right? To survive the job market and get a faculty position. Particularly difficult this year with the restrictions that the pandemic has put on us in terms of hiring freezes all across academia. The big rite of passage in the job market, of course, is the job talk. And there's generally an expectation that rookie job talks are expected to be empirical in nature, right? People want to see your capabilities on the empirical side. And so, doctoral students may think, well, I'm not going to devote much effort to theory because that's not really what's going to get me that first job. Then there's also perhaps some ambiguity, right? This question of what is theory is debated kind of endlessly. What constitutes a good theoretical contribution, or even a theoretical contribution at all? There's been a lot written on this. You know, we cite a lot of these papers in our essay simply to distinguish what we're doing from what they're doing. But you know, there's papers on what theory is not, you know, what theory isn't, theorizing is, and et cetera, et cetera. You've seen these papers, I'm sure, and they all have a useful role. It is helpful to have those philosophical debates and discussions, but it doesn't necessarily help you at the end of the day to actually make a theoretical contribution, to go through those debates. And then, so there's maybe ambiguity about what is theory. Okay, then finally, well, not finally, another one is, you know, training. We get a lot of methodology courses in doctoral training, but they are typically focused on empirical methodologies and particularly focused on statistical methodologies. You know, really, it's not just that we're missing methods courses for theory. We're also missing, for the most part, methods courses for data collection and research design and that sort of thing, right? You know, if all our methods courses do is teach us, you know, how to do ever more sophisticated econometric methods, I guess that's useful, but it's not a complete education in methods, right? A complete education in methods would have to include things like, you know, study design, would have to include things like measurement and data collection, and honestly, theory development, right? So the fact that there is typically no methods course for theory also makes it difficult for doctoral students to make a contribution there. And then finally, we think that, you know, and we said this in the essay, we think that perhaps doctoral students may be confounded if they are assuming that any contribution to theory has to be some kind of big paradigm shifting grand theory, right? And that anything short of that is not a contribution to theory. And this is just grandiosity. This is grandiose thinking. Making a theoretical contribution is not just about making some big new paradigm shift. There are lots of ways to contribute to theory in less grandiose ways. So you know, I can understand that if your impression is that theory is all about, you know, some big new paradigm shifting grand theory, then yeah, that would seem like a pretty daunting task to take on, and you might not want to do that, right? But that's not all it's all about. So we cannot, in this essay, obviously solve all of these problems. And by the way, perhaps there may be more diagnoses out there about what's the cause of PhD students not doing more theory. But these are my 5 working hypotheses. And we can't, you know, in this essay, we can't fix all of these. We certainly can't, you know, fix the role modeling and incentives piece. It's not our business to fix the ambiguity piece. But we can maybe contribute a little bit to these last 2 bullet points by perhaps alleviating some of the confusion about what making a contribution to theory is, and also perhaps providing a little bit of a substitute for the lack of a methods course in theory. So really, basically, what I want to say here is the essay, you know, in lieu of having a methods course in theory, what the essay provides is kind of a cookbook, if you would, which has a kind of a set of recipes of ways to make contributions to theory, right? Okay. So our advice, I think, in the essay is basically to keep it simple. rather than taking on the grand, daunting task of developing a whole new paradigm shift, focus on making small, bite-sized contributions that can extend or revise an existing theory in interesting and useful ways. So how do you do that? Well, we provide in the essay a taxonomy of approaches, which are summarized in this figure 1, which obviously is too small for you to read here. So I'll be expanding pieces of it in the subsequent slides. But basically, at the top of the figure, you see inputs. What are the research questions? These are the kind of how and why questions that drive research. That we're trying to, how and why questions that theory is trying to provide speculative answers to. And then out the bottom of the figure are the outputs, things like explanations, predictions, prescriptions, etc. The middle, though, I think is where a lot of the action takes place. Because often that's the middle is where the opportunities often tend to be overlooked. Yes, it's interesting and important to think about bringing up new research questions at the top of the figure as an input, right? It's also interesting to think about what kinds of outputs you can derive from theories at the bottom. But I believe that a lot of the contribution to theory takes place right there in the middle, in the theorizing process. And so what we're going to do there is look at specific levers, what we call levers of the theorizing process. And basically, those levers answer kind of the who, what, when, where, why, and how of theory, right? So we're going to go through those in a little bit of detail. Okay. So let me start with the input, the research question. Uh-oh, somebody is drawing on my slide. Is that possible? Looks like somebody has made a little sketch on my slide there. Okay. So a research question is the main input into the theorizing process. Without a research question, there's really nothing to theorize about. Every field of study has its own kind of uniquely characteristic research questions. And, Rumelt, Schendel, and Thies in their 1994 book, Fundamental Questions of, what was it called? Fundamental Issues in Strategy. They do the field a great service by providing a list of questions that they identify as fundamental questions in strategy that include things like, how do firms behave? Why are firms different? What is the function or value added by the headquarters unit in a diversified firm? And so different fields basically pose different sets of questions. So one obvious way to make a contribution to theory would then be to change the research question, right? So basically, or either by asking a completely new question, or by modifying an existing question in some way, or applying an existing theory to address a different question, right? So let's take each of those in turn. So the challenge with asking a completely new question is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it expands the field's boundaries to ask a new question. On the other hand, it may provoke a defensive response from the field, particularly from reviewers and editors of your paper, who may say, that's a clever question, but is it really a fill in the blank? Like, is it really a strategy question, or is it really an OB question, or is it really an HR question? Whatever field the journal is purporting to represent, they may raise questions about whether this new research question actually fits within the boundaries of the field that they're representing. And so that's why it's a double-edged sword, because, on the one hand, it may really represent a big advance. On the other hand, it may, you may get some pushback. You may get some backlash. Okay. So a second way of changing the research question is to modify an old research question, right? So one way to do that is to perhaps change or narrow the terms or the context, right? So, for example, let's go back to that fundamental question strategy that Rumelt, Schendel, and Thies asked, what is the function or value added by the headquarters unit in a diversified firm? Well, I could change the context of that question. I could say, what is the function of or value added by the headquarters unit in a nonprofit organization? Or what is the function of or value added by the headquarters unit in a government agency, right? So that would be changing the context of the question. I could also maybe take that question and focus in on a particular aspect of value added, right? Because or a particular aspect of function, right? So function or value added, those are pretty general terms. And I could maybe narrow the question by looking at a particular type of way to add value or a particular type of function. So that's a way to kind of take an existing research question and kind of refresh it and rejuvenate it by perhaps changing or narrowing the terms or the context within which the question is being asked. Another possibility is to apply old theory to a new research question, right? So, maybe, maybe the theory of, let's say, real options has been applied to answer the question of how firms behave and why do firms differ in their performance, but maybe it hasn't been applied to the question of what function or added value is provided by the top management in firms or something like that, right? So you take an existing theory and perhaps apply it to a question that it hasn't been applied to yet. Okay. Now, what makes a good theory? That's another question, right? So a good, or I should say maybe not a good theory. What makes a good research question, right? Because the research question is just the input into the theory. What makes for a good research question? Well, a good research question really should be broad enough to interest a wide audience and yet be narrow enough to be answerable. Vague questions tend to impede progress. So even when a topic is clearly both important and interesting, research on it may flounder until the research question is framed in a way that is specific enough to be answered. I'll give credit here to Dick Rumelt. I saw him at a research conference. He gave a presentation where he made this observation. He said, in the early days of the strategy field, the question that was on people's mind basically was this kind of vague question of what strategy should a company pursue? And that's really just kind of too vague and amorphous a question to make much progress on. The field started to make more progress once the question was framed in really more specific terms. For example, when Porter, in his 1979 Harvard Business Review article, Porter made a valuable contribution by changing the conversation to the more focused and manageable research question of what makes an industry attractive, right? So the question of what strategy should a company pursue, very kind of vague, amorphous, general. The question of what makes an industry attractive, that's more specific, that's more answerable. Okay, so that kind of takes care of what I have to say about the research question. So now we're going to move into the middle box in the figure 1 diagram and look at each of the different levers of the theorizing process. So the first one is the mode of theorizing. So the mode of theorizing is the lever that defines how we theorize. Deductive theory is one possible mode. In deductive theory, you start with a set of general assumptions, sometimes about unobservable constructs like utility maximization. And from these general assumptions, you logically deduce what specific implications can be derived from those general assumptions. On the other hand, inductive theory is a different kind of mode of theorizing, which starts with specific observations of the real world and relies on comparisons between them in order to make inferences about possible generalizations. These two modes of inductive and deductive represent a trade-off between realism and reproducibility. Inductive theory, being grounded in real-world observations, enjoys the benefit of realism, but may be weak in reproducibility because simply different researchers could look at the same set of observations and infer different generalizations. Deductive theory is kind of the opposite. By contrast, deductive theory may be less realistic because it is not necessarily grounded in observations at all, but it generates highly reproducible results because any researcher who is armed with the basic tools of deductive logic can confirm whether or not the conclusions are actually implied by the assumptions. Process modeling aims to explain how a particular entity changes over time, whereas variance modeling aims to explain why entities differ from each other. So when I said earlier that a theory is just kind of a fancy word for a speculative answer to a how question or a why question, I'll just note here that if we're asking a how question, we tend to be thinking in terms of process theory. If we're asking a why question, we tend to be thinking in terms of variance-based theories, right? So how questions are more process-based, why questions are more variance-based. Let's see. So then you have the possibility of static versus dynamic theories, right? So static theories tend to examine how a system and its parts behave under a steady state equilibrium, where all the forces affecting the system are kind of in balance with each other. Whereas dynamic theories examine how a system and its parts move and evolve under the influence of forces that may push the system toward equilibrium or away from equilibrium or between equilibria. Then you also have the distinction between formal and informal theories. Informal theories rely on the natural language of verbal reasoning and therefore are accessible to a broad audience. But the trade-off is there that formal theories rely on the rigorous languages of logic, mathematics, and simulation, which are perhaps provide a stronger audit trail for the theory, but may be challenging for audiences without the specialized training needed to understand what they're saying. Within the realm of formal theory, analytical methods like game theory derive exact results, but can only be used for models with relatively few parameters in order to maintain their tractability, whereas numerical methods like simulation can handle much more complex models with a larger number of parameters. But simulations tend to yield only approximate results whose causality may be more difficult to interpret. Okay, so inductive versus deductive. Sorry, I should have been processing these bullet points as I went through. Inductive versus deductive, process-based versus variance-based, static versus dynamic, formal versus informal, and analytical versus numerical. Let me just provide a few quick examples of this. Arkady Sokurtov and Tim Folta have a series of papers that add a new dynamic element to the formally static theory of the multi-business firm by focusing on the inherently intertemporal concepts of resource redeployability. That's a tongue twister there. Resource redeployability, right? So that would be an example of switching between the static and the dynamic mode, right? By adding a dynamic element by looking at resource redeployability. In terms of switching from informal to formal theorizing modes, that's becoming increasingly popular as a way to contribute to theory. So for example, the issue of value appropriation has been recognized as an important yet largely overlooked factor in informal resource-based theories of the firm. Castanius and Helfat and Russ Koff made some important contributions to the theory of value appropriation within the firm, but they did so largely in an informal way. Whereas now this topic has switched to a more formal mode of theorizing, as folks like Adam Brandenburger, Gus Stewart, Glenn MacDonald, and Mike Ryle have been applying coalitional game theory as a powerful new tool for distilling down understanding of value appropriation within the firm in more precise ways, with more precise distinctions. Okay. So that takes care of lever one, the mode of theorizing. Now let me move on to lever two, the level of analysis, right? So just as you can change the mode of theory, you can change the research question, you can change the mode of theorizing, you can also potentially change the level of analysis, right? So the level of analysis is the lever of theorizing that defines who we are theorizing about. Although, you know, the strategic management field is defined, and I'm a strategy guy. I know not everybody on the call is in the strategy field, although perhaps most are. You know, I'll speak about it from the perspective of strategy. You can translate as you wish to your own field, whether it's organizational behavior, or human resources management, or whatever you're studying. You know, my field of strategic management is defined by a concern for understanding the heterogeneity of overall organizational performance. But that does not mean, for example, that all strategy studies must be done at the organizational level of analysis, even though just because our overall, you know, goal is to understand organizational performance, that doesn't mean that all of our studies have to be at the organization level of analysis, right? Research at other levels of analysis can still have important implications for organizational performance. So strategy studies have also focused at higher levels of analysis, right? Supra-organizational levels of analysis, such as the alliance, the joint venture, market, industry, field, institution, or even nation, and have also, strategy has also included studies at sub-organizational levels of analysis, such as the division, department, transaction, team, or even individual level. Now, you know, the challenge here is that blindly applying an unaltered theory to a different level of analysis may require inappropriate assumptions or generate implausible results. So this is not something you can do blindly, to, you know, apply a theory to a new level of analysis where it wasn't originally intended. But with careful adaptation and appropriate adjustments, some elements of theory at one level of analysis may be at least partly relevant at other levels of analysis. And these adaptations represent opportunities to make a contribution to theory. So as a nice example of this, you know, firms compete with each other, and so do nations. But these two types of competition differ in important ways. And so Michael Porter, who made some very important contributions to the theory of competition between firms, also then, you know, later in his 1990 book, applied some of that logic to competition between nations, but he had to make adjustments along the way because the theory didn't apply, you know, directly. So the result was an important contribution to theory to take, you know, basically the ideas from his first two books, his 1980 and 1985 books on competitive strategy and competitive advantage, and apply them to the competitive advantage of nations in his 1990 book. Conversely, you know, you do sometimes see in the literature where somebody does make a blind application of a theory to a level of analysis where it doesn't completely apply. And when this happens, that kind of opens up another opportunity for a contribution to research, which is to correct that misapplication, right? So if somebody out there is misapplying a theory from one level of analysis to another level of analysis, critique and correction of this misapplication can be a useful theoretical contribution. Now, occasionally, it may even be possible to introduce an entirely new level of analysis that researchers had previously overlooked, which itself can be a great contribution to theory. So a well-known example of this in the strategy literature was the introduction of the concept of strategic groups by Michael Porter in a 1979 paper. Such innovations, you know, as long as they can explain something that cannot be explained using other levels of analysis, can be major contributions to theory. Okay, so let me move on in the interest of time to the next lever, which is changing the phenomenon. So whereas the level of analysis defines who the theory is applied to, the phenomenon defines where the theory is applied, right? So the phenomenon is the lever that defines where the theory is relevant. That is the context of the theory. Any given theory may be relevant in multiple contexts with implications for multiple phenomena. But since organizations, which are the phenomenon that we study most often, organizations and markets and industries are all multifaceted, complex systems, interconnected systems, right? These are the phenomena that we tend to focus on, organizations, markets, and industries. They're multifaceted, complex systems with lots of parts that connect to each other in a variety of different ways. And because of that, forces that affect one part are likely to affect other parts as well. So one potentially important question is how they affect these other parts. And the challenge of answering that question offers numerous opportunities to make important theoretical contributions. Right, so you have a whole set of legacy phenomena, right? So things like planning, formulation, implementation, performance, cognition, decision-making, innovation, technology, politics, renewal, turnaround, governance, joint ventures, mergers, acquisitions, etc. And you can look at theories that have been applied to one of these phenomena and ask whether they also are applicable to other phenomena in this list, right? You can say, maybe a theory that's been applied to joint ventures might be useful for thinking about leadership. Maybe a theory that's been applied to turnarounds may be useful in thinking about networks or alliances, right? So there's opportunities here to consider, because we are dealing with complex interconnected phenomena whose parts affect each other, we can think about how theories that have been applied to one phenomena might also affect other phenomena. We don't need to even rely on these legacy phenomena because fortunately the world, with its constant stream of technological and social innovations, is delivering kind of a never-ending stream of new phenomena to which old theories might be applied. And each of these represents an opportunity to make a theoretical contribution, right? So the emerging phenomena today are things like platforms, business models, blockchain, smart contract, open innovation, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, AI, machine learning, robotics, quantum computing, self-managing organizations, and all that. So, a useful contribution to theory might be to say, well, how do our existing theories apply to these new emerging phenomena? Now, an early example of this was how Kathy Harrigan, back in the 1980s, looked at the phenomenon that was just very much emerging and new at that time, which was joint ventures. Before the 1980s, that just really was not a popular way for companies to do business. So when it emerged as a phenomenon in the 1980s, Harrigan jumped on that bandwagon and said, how does our existing theory apply and help inform our understanding of this puzzling new phenomenon of joint ventures? A more recent example is how Teppo Polina and Todd Zenger applied existing theories of governance to explain the emerging phenomenon of open innovation. Okay, so that's all I've got to say about phenomena. So let me move on to the next lever, which is the causal mechanism. To me, among all the levers of the theorizing process, this one is the heart of the matter, because the causal mechanism is perhaps the most central aspect of any theory. It's the aspect of the theory that the theory relies upon as the foundation for its own internal logic. The causal mechanism is the lever that defines why the theory's proposed relationships or effects occur, right? So the theory proposes a bunch of effects or relationships, but doesn't really provide an answer to the question of why those relationships or effects are occurring. Then it's not really a theory, right? Because a theory is always kind of the answer to a why or a how question. So causal mechanisms tend to have, a disciplinary flavor, right? You have, psychological causal mechanisms, things like cognition, affect, learning, motivation, perception, attachment, right? There are also sociological causal mechanisms such as conformity, deviance, conflict, power, status seeking, deference, social structure, etc. Then there are also economic mechanisms, things like equilibrium, competition, collusion, cooperation, bargaining, contracting, preemption, flexibility, strategizing, rent seeking, incentivizing, right? So causal mechanisms do tend to have this kind of disciplinary flavor. Well, there are several ways that researchers can make contributions to theory by focusing on the causal mechanisms. One obvious way would be to introduce or import a causal mechanism that had not previously been recognized as relevant to a particular research question, right? So, a great example is this long-standing stream of research on the question of why the dominant positions of strong incumbents get disrupted by weak upstarts, right? And that question was initially studied actually through an economic lens. Where folks like Freudenberg and Tirole and Gelman and Salop and Gemawat looked at the issue of cannibalization as perhaps the explanation for why incumbents with dominant positions tend to lose those dominant positions to upstarts, because perhaps they would risk cannibalizing their own business. And so therefore they lose opportunities. So that's an economic lens, an economic mechanism to try to understand why dominant incumbents get disrupted by upstarts. Then later, the same question was addressed through a more sociological set of causal mechanisms like structural inertia, where folks like Rebecca Henderson and Dorothy Leonard Barton took a look at the ways in which inertia could contribute to the downfall of strong incumbents. And then most recently, you have seen basically the work of Clayton Christensen and his co-authors bring a more psychological lens to this question, basically saying that there's a cognitive or perceptual reason for incumbents to be disrupted by upstarts, that they just don't see it coming in some sense, right? Or their cognition, they're too focused on their existing customers to be bothered with thinking about new markets. So that's more of a psychological or cognitive mechanism. So what I'm saying here is the same research question, the same phenomenon can be addressed from multiple causal mechanisms. And each of those three stops on that journey for understanding how dominant incumbents get disrupted was a useful contribution to theory. Now, another type of contribution to theory using the causal mechanism would be to synthesize across multiple causal mechanisms, right? This tends to be what I specialize in. I'll develop formal models where I'll incorporate two or more causal mechanisms, and I'll look at their interaction effect, right? So that's a different kind of contribution to theory using the causal mechanism. It's to synthesize multiple causal mechanisms in a way that explores how they interact with each other through their mediating and moderating effects. In this way, you can derive results from a combination of causal mechanisms that you perhaps could not derive from any one of them individually. Right, okay, good. Okay, so let me move on to the next lever, which is the lever 5, as we call it, the constructs and variables. Constructs and variables define the what of theory, right? it's the lever that defines what we are theorizing about. For example, there are conceptual constructs whose introduction, so one thing you can do to make a contribution to theory at the construct or variable level is to simply introduce a new construct or introduce a new variable, right? So some examples of contributions to theory through introducing a new construct or a new variable. One would be Lippmann and Rumelt's introduction of the concept of causal ambiguity. Cohen and Leventhal's introduction of the concept of absorptive capacity. David Ties's introduction of the concept of complementary assets. And his later contribution of the concept of dynamic capabilities. Jay Barney's introduction of the concept of a strategic factor market, right? So each of these is a construct or a variable that was new to the literature in these different contributions. For example, Barney, in introducing this concept of the well, let me just say this. So another way of making a contribution to theory through the constructs or variables is to question an existing construct or variable. A great example of this was when Jay Barney published an article questioning the usefulness of the whole construct of strategic groups. And in a sense, you can see that article as a necessary stepping stone toward advancing resource-based view as a replacement theory, because it was necessary to have the existing theory of intra-industry, within industry performance differentials was strategic groups. But if Barney was going to replace strategic groups with resources as the explanation for within industry performance differences, then he really needed to shoot down the whole concept of strategic groups, and he had a paper doing that. So another possibility is to import a construct or variable from another field. We've probably seen a lot of this. So a great example of this was Dan Leventhal's bringing in the construct of the NK model from biology. Okay, and then another way to contribute to theory based on changing the constructs or variables is to simply change the role that a construct or variable plays in the theory, right? Because each conceptual construct or variable in the theory plays a particular role. So it may be the focal phenomenon of interest that you're trying to explain, that variable may be, or the variable may be an antecedent that explains the concept of the focal phenomenon of interest, or it may be a consequence of the phenomenon of interest, or it may be a moderator or a mediator, right? So there's all those different possible roles that a concept or a construct or a variable can play in a theory. And so one could make a contribution to theory by simply playing around with switching the concept, switching the variable from one role to another. So, one example of this from my own work is my paper with Jens Schmidt and Thomas Kyle, in which we say, hey, look, everybody pretty much has taken the boundaries between industries as an exogenously determined antecedent to whatever it is they're trying to explain. And instead we say, well, let's make that the phenomenon that we're trying to explain, the boundary between industries, right? So rather than taking it as an antecedent that explains something else, we take it as the phenomenon to be explained in that paper, right? So that's an example of making a contribution by changing the role of a particular variable or construct. Okay. Then another lever 6 here, is the boundary condition. So the boundary condition is the lever that defines when our theory does or does not work, when it applies and when it doesn't apply, right? So so there are a variety of different ways to make contributions to the theory using boundary conditions, right? So one of those is to clarify hidden assumptions. So in one way, actually, even before we get to clarifying hidden assumptions, is simply to work out what the boundary conditions of a new theory are, right? So in some cases, especially when a new theory is being initially developed through some informal mode of theorizing, its boundary conditions may still be unclear or subject to debate. And such a theory may, rely on assumptions that are not fully articulated. So in that case, exposing or clarifying the theory's assumptions can represent a useful contribution because it serves to, explain the boundary conditions of where the theory does or does not apply. Now, applying formal methods tends to be very helpful in this regard, because formal methods tend to, because you have to apply the rigorous discipline of logical derivation in formal theorizing, it becomes clear what assumptions are and are not necessary. So as an example of this, right, so the theory of the conditions under which you can derive competitive advantage from causal ambiguity is a theory where, the boundary conditions are maybe not clear, the assumptions are maybe not clear. So Mike Ryle in 2009 published a paper where he developed a formal theory of the conditions under which you could derive competitive advantage from causal ambiguity, and thereby defined the boundary conditions around that theory. Now, another way to make a contribution to theory using boundary conditions is to identify internal inconsistencies, right? So, or logical inconsistencies in general. So if theory's own boundary conditions are logically inconsistent with each other, then you got trouble, right? There may be no conditions under which the theory actually applies, which would be a potentially powerful critique of the theory. So Slater and Spencer in the year 2000, they published a paper, I think it was in SMJ, where they argued that there's a fundamental inconsistency about the assumptions, a fundamental inconsistency between the assumptions that transaction cost economics theory makes about rationality, right? So on one hand, transaction cost economics makes the explicit assumption that actors are not rational enough to do contracting perfectly, right? To have complete contracts, right? So they're not rational enough for complete contracts. But on the other hand, it assumes that they are rational enough to choose between governance structures, right? So on one hand, they're not rational enough to do complete contracting, but they are rational enough to choose between governance structures perfectly, right? To choose optimal governance structures. And so, they make the argument that those two assumptions are kind of fundamentally inconsistent with each other, and they use that to kind of try to take down the entire logic of transaction cost theory. So that's a contribution to theory. A different type of logical inconsistency is not internal, but external, right? So you can find logical inconsistencies with other theories. That's when the assumptions of two different theories conflict with each other. Uncovering those kinds of inconsistencies between theories can be a valuable contribution by providing an indicator that the theories offer incompatible competing explanations, so that empirical testing may offer an opportunity to rule out one theory or the other, or at least to assess the conditions under which one theory is more likely to apply than the other, right? Another possible way to make a contribution here is to tighten up the boundary conditions in order to derive more specific implications of the theory. So, we can create different versions of a theory by either restricting or relaxing its boundary conditions, right? So, for example, it may be possible to derive additional predictions from a theory or predictions of greater specificity when the boundary conditions are restricted, although that greater predictive power may come at the expense of reduced generality. For example, Jean-Francois Henart was able to derive new predictions from the existing transaction cost economic theory by applying that theory more narrowly to the special case of equity joint ventures. Conversely, the generality of a theory may be broadened to the generality of a theory may be broadened by applying it to a wider variety of contexts by relaxing its boundary conditions. Although, this may weaken its predictive power. That is, it may reduce the number or the specificity of predictions that can be derived from the theory. So, as an example of this, in their 2003 paper, Gonzalo Pacheco de Almeida and Peter Zemsky generalized the theory of strategic investment under uncertainty by recognizing that some resources and capabilities take time to develop, right? So they're basically taking an existing, theory of strategic investment under uncertainty and broadening it out to a wider set of conditions where it could apply. Let me pause just for a moment and check in with Sergey and Ibrat to see if we have any news about any guests that may be joining us. Is there?
Certainly we have, Richard. We have...
is our guest with us?
Yes, and would you like to introduce our guest?
Sure, I will introduce our special guest, if I can find him on the screen. Let me just say I'm delighted that he's able to join us. So I'm going to introduce to you a great mentor of mine and co-author on this essay, Jay Barney. Jay, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, Jay, welcome on board. So I invited Jay to come for a few minutes, 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever he can spare, to say a few words to the gathered masses, and maybe if he's willing to maybe take a few questions.
Sure. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate the opportunity. Rich got me involved in this essay sort of well into its development. I think I had a small marginal impact on its content, but it was a good piece of work. Hopefully it gives people direction. Thanks, Rich, also for organizing this event. I'm not sure who else was involved, but this is something very, very important. It says my internet connection is unstable. No, it's back. Okay.
I can hear you just fine.
So I've just finished up as my term is okay. I just finished up as my term as the editor of AMR. I actually am still working on a lot of papers, but formally I'm not the editor-in-chief any longer. And so I've had the chance to read and evaluate roughly 2,000 papers over the last 3 years. Since we're a theory journal, obviously the big challenge, of course, is for people to really step up to the bar and try to make a contribution to theory. And most of the papers actually fall well short of that goal. And if I was to sort of say one reason for that, sort of the primary reason for that, although there's lots of specific examples that we go through, and certainly the SMJ articles talks a lot about how to make those contributions. But if there's a meta weakness that I've seen across these papers, it would be that the papers are just not clear what their research question is. What question are you trying to answer? I don't know if you've already talked about this, Rich, but in my experience, I have a real simple test that I use with PhD students, but I think it applies pretty generally. And that test is, if it takes you more than 15 seconds to explain your research question, you do not yet understand your research question. Sometimes early stages of dissertation are sort of the classic examples of that problem where, so tell me about your research. And then 10 minutes later, we're still trying to understand what your research is about. Well, that's fine, because you're just trying to understand it yourself. But by the time you come to writing a paper, if you can't say your research question very, very precisely and very quickly, and if you can't write it in a single sentence, then you're not actually ready to make a contribution yet. And so I have worked with, I'm working with 2 papers right now that I've asked for a revise and resubmit. But the revision basically was, I think I understand your research question. I read 30 pages, 35 pages, or 40 pages of your paper, and I'm still guessing about your research question. But if it's this, then all these really cool things can happen. In both of these papers, I've suggested at least 2 research questions that are consistent with what they're talking about. But they have to decide, and then once they decide, then they can figure out how to write the paper. I always hold myself to the discipline in any paper that I'm writing that I want to have one sentence that defines my research question, and it should be no longer than 24 words. I'll grant 24 is totally arbitrary here, but nevertheless, it's a discipline that I try to keep myself focused on. So I'm open to answering any questions people might have, but that was in this short period of time, that was the thing I wanted to mention that has been the most obvious challenge for, these are people writing theory papers. I think exactly the same thing holds for writing empirical papers. If you don't know the question you're asking and trying to answer, then neither will your readers, and certainly not your reviewers. So.
May I kick off with the questions? I will try to summarize the questions in the chat that we have had during the last 45 minutes. So my question will be very, very open.
There was one question that was specifically addressed to Jay, though, at the bottom of the chat.
One question is, what is the source of inspiration for the research questions? So how should we attack the problem of creating relevant and impactful theory in the strategic management research?
Yeah, it's a question I'm always asked, or often asked. Where do you get your ideas? And it's ironic because I think of many more papers I could write than I can write. I mean, I just don't have the time. I literally come up with a paper idea almost every day. So, like, oh, that would be cool. We could do this, but you know, most of them don't get operationalized just because there's not enough time in the day to do it all. So, with that in mind, I do have a couple things that I do that keep me moving forward with new ideas all the time, new questions to ask. One of them is, some of this is going to be pretty straightforward. Like, I think it's really important to go to conferences. Now, that's obvious and also really difficult right now. So I understand that challenge, but trust me. Not to go to regular paper sessions usually, because by the time a paper gets published in a paper session or presented, it's probably 2 years old, seriously. But you go to the to panel sessions, or you just find some smart people and hang out. What are they talking about? What are they interested in? And that just sort of keeps you in touch with what's going on. The second thing I do is, in addition to my scholarly work, I do a fair amount of consulting, just to keep myself embedded in a bit of reality. I don't pretend I'm a manager. In fact, I think I wouldn't be very good at it. But I'm interested in the challenges that managers face, and so working with them, helping them understand their own situation, being a sounding board for them, is a way for me to think about things too. In fact, my recent paper in SMJ in 2018 on Stakeholder Theory came at least in part from my experience working in companies where smart managers who I had deep respect for were becoming very concerned about stakeholders, and I didn't understand that. And I could either conclude that these people were all crazy, or I conclude that maybe they saw something that I didn't understand. And so rather than assuming they're all crazy, I spent 3 years trying to figure out what they were doing and why. And then the third thing is also going to be very strange, but to some of you, which is that I try to read widely. I don't read just the literature. In fact, I'm really bad at reading literature. I count on my doctoral students to point out articles I should read for me. There's so much that's published. I need triage, so let someone else do that for me, which leaves me time to read more broadly. And I read history, I read biographies primarily, and just to be exposed to different ways of thinking. I'm reading a really interesting book by a philosopher right now on moral revolutions and how they occur. And the first part of the book is, why did the tradition of dueling in Europe go away? It's just like, what a great question. I never thought about that before. And he's now, and so I just try to read really broadly. When I was in graduate school many decades ago, I was at Yale, and the Yale Library, the main library, is an incredible building and space. The inside looks like kind of like a cathedral in the main area, and then you go, and the stacks, when I was there at least, were open. And I think it's maybe 12 stories, but the stories aren't full stories. They're like maybe 7 feet tall. So the racks of books go from the floor to the ceiling. And so all I used to do when I was feeling like I need a little bit of inspiration is I would randomly choose a floor. And as long as it wasn't in a foreign language, I would go into that, and I would then randomly choose a row, and I just pulled out a book and read it. Just read it, just skim it, see what's going on. And first of all, it was a great experience because this is quite powerful for me, because the way that the library is physically organized, it's like you're sitting in the middle of a book. You're surrounded by books, and it's a great experience. There's a smell, there's a feeling of a great deep intellect there. And then, sometimes I pulled out books that were completely useless, and then other times I read this book about a French philosopher who I didn't know anything about, and suddenly, wow, that's interesting. So I try to read widely, not just deeply. I know of doctoral students, it's mostly deep. I got that, different stages in careers, but I also try to read very broadly. I also read 2 or 3 non-academic books, well, at least non-business strategy books at the same time to sort of keep me going that way. So those are the things that work for me. I will say that in the end, the very best theoretical contributions are deeply autobiographical. So it's also about learning what's important to yourself.
That's great. Thank you very much. If I may, another question, but at the other side of the process. So we've started with the formulating of a research question. On the other side, we need to formulate a theory. So there's a question in the chat, how to make that leap from the rigorous methodological process of extracting results to theorizing, to that creative process. So generalization beyond the data. So, and whether there is a rigor in theorizing as well.
Well, the rigor in theorizing is a matter of you're in that. So being able to specify what are the boundary conditions ex ante in your theoretical work, being able to know exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish, all those are forms of rigor. If you want to do math modeling, there's another form of rigor that's associated with that. But a good math model will always have an intuition that is also interesting, and that might be then reflected in the mathematics, but it's not necessarily so. I'm comfortable with both formal modeling and verbal modeling. Rich and I have worked together on one formal model. So I think actually it's every bit as rigorous, although differently so, than quantitative work. The problem that I see right now in our field with regard to quantitative work, and this is very common among PhD students coming out of the job market, is that the theory discussion in their job market paper, if it exists at all, is 30 seconds. I'm just in this question. Its context, its important, or so importance is just left to our imagination, and then the presenter moves on to the data and the models. And what we end up is with incredibly sophisticated, deeply rigorous analyses of data that have little or no impact on the way we think about the world. That is, little or impact on theory. And the other thing that's interesting about that is, just from a methodological point of view, these really sophisticated techniques to describe something going on in industry that I think if you talk to 3 managers in the industry, they would tell you that already. So I mean, it's not even clear that this is the only way to get that kind of perspective. But simply describing the data and modeling it very rigorously, doing all sorts of 2-stage least squares, all those things, is not connected to answering a question that is theoretically relevant. Then it's, and I know Rich has used this analogy too, then it's incredibly sophisticated, complicated journalism. It's just fine. If you want to be a journalist, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, truly. But that's not science. Science is about creating theory and testing theory. So I don't think there's much difference in terms of the rigor.
Thank you very much. And another question, if I may, rather pragmatic. So at the late stages of PhD projects, there's an option to submit the thesis as an article, for example, to IMR journal, or is it better to collaborate with a more experienced theorist before submitting? So another way to pose the question, whether the rejection and feedback is a good learning curve for PhD students and graduates.
You know, I would think that I wish I could say that the review process is always developmental. I don't think it always is. Sometimes the reviewers or the editors don't step up and really be as developmental as they could have been. But on the other hand, there are times, and certainly in my experience, there are times when the review process has been extremely important in the development of the ideas. And so, but there's a question, I think, hidden behind the question, which is that should young people try to write theory papers, or should they be deferred to people like myself who, I don't have gray hair, I have light black hair, deeply light black. People like me. I mean, obviously, personal preferences are extremely important here, and I would never tell you to do something that you don't want to do. But if you really want to write a theory paper, if you think you have something to say that's important, then you should write the theory paper. Rich knows this story, he's heard it too many times, but you know, I wrote the first drafts of the strategic factor markets paper and of the journal management paper, 91 journal management paper, in 1 year in 1984. At the time, I was 30 years old. So I was just a kid, and I made all sorts of mistakes in those processes. But nevertheless, I thought I had some important questions to ask, and I thought I might have a possible answer. So, so I would encourage you, if you think you have a passion for theory, then why would you not exercise that passion?
Great, thank you very much. I think we can open the opportunity to ask you questions to the audience. So guys, if you are brave enough, just unmute yourself and ask Jay Barney a relevant question.
I'm not a particularly nasty person. Well, I'm nasty to Rich, but that's it.
I appreciate your nastiness, but I don't want to overstay our welcome. Jay, what are your time constraints here?
I was really more concerned about taking away from your
program, don't worry about
Rich.
That. We put kind of a flexible time boundary on this.
Well, I got another 5 minutes then, so I'll be fine.
Okay.
So Dr. Barney, do you think deductive reasoning, how useful it is to generating theory in the strategy field based on the nature of the field? Like, do you have any examples?
Of what kind of reasoning?
Deductive reasoning.
Oh, deductive reasoning. Well, yeah. all my theorizing is deductive. So, I mean, so the distinction between deductive, inductive, and abductive sort of breaks down in real life, because in real life, you think it's deductive, and then you realize you've been hanging out with managers who do things that make it partly inductive. So it's sort of a mishmash, but there are lots of examples of deductive theorizing in strategy. I'm not opposed to inductive reasoning. At AMR, we don't publish inductive papers because they're empirical by definition. And we don't publish empirical papers. So I haven't had a chance to really review a lot of those or review in depth a lot of those papers. Mm-hmm. But I do know that inductive reasoning has some challenges associated with it. That is, generalizing beyond the inductive case is often very challenging. So, mm-hmm. But I'm not saying that's not an important way of thinking about the world. But I would, for me, most of the theories that are most influential in the field of strategy are quite deductive in nature. What are the core assumptions? What if you bring those assumptions together, what implications those have? You know, it takes time to figure this stuff out deductively. The 2018 paper in SMJ, really, it just draws out implications that were in the 1986 strategic factor marker paper. And I wrote the paper in 1986 or 1984, and then was published in 86. And it took, 30 years for me to understand the implications of my own paper. So this deductive process can take some time, but I think deductive reasonings are very important.
Yeah, because the strategy is different from physics. It's like Dr. Like Rich mentioned, it's you don't have like one. It seems like it's not like one rule, like in physics. So
well, physics, but physics. First of all, physics is also inductive as well as deductive. The background noise that was proof of the Big Bang, for which two Bell Labs scientists won the Nobel Prize, was, as I understand it, kind of an accidental discovery. Mm-hmm. So that's clearly an inductive kind of work. But physics is one. The physical sciences are one model for how theory is done and needs to be done, but we had special challenges in the social sciences, let's just put it that way. But that doesn't mean we can't do deductive theory.
Right, because then when we are doing, like probably most of will be inductive, but when we are doing inductive, so when you do a theory paper, I mean, like a lot of times we induct from cases, right? So we see something in our daily life, we always theorize like amateurs. But when we are building a theory, when you induct from case studies, I mean, there's always this challenge about, oh, wow, you only have a few, or, you know, but shouldn't that be left to for the people who are doing the empirical paper to test, to gather the sample size? And so, I mean, how do you deal with the challenge, like when you're writing a theory paper, they say, oh, you only have one case, or you only have 3 cases, you know, like that.
Well, I mean, that's if you develop an inductive theory paper, that's always going to be the challenge, is to convince people that the theory that you've induced from your cases has broader implications. And I will say, my interactions with the people at AMJ and SMJ, they are really interested in publishing inductive qualitative research. They don't actually publish much of it. And the reason they don't publish much of it is it tends not to meet the standards of rigor that you just described. It's not generalizable. It's descriptive, but not theoretically relevant.
Okay, so are you saying the rigor, the standard, is based on the boundary conditions, or how you specify the research criteria? It's not like how many cases you are inducting from.
I mean, that certainly is part of the story.
Okay.
But there is some interesting work by Kathy Eisenhart on using multiple case studies as a way to induce and then ultimately to test theory. And so it is possible to do that very carefully, rigorously. But I think we've got to the world where the sort of the N of 1, unless it's an incredibly interesting case, that case is probably not going to be able to get you what you need to do to get published in the top journals.
But in daily life, don't we all theorizing from n equal 1, and then you can test, right? So can we separate it? You know, when we all, you know, we are all doing it every day, theorizing from n equals 1, and then I mean, of course, it still needs to be tested.
Yeah, there certainly is a cognitive bias that we tend to do, generalize from small samples. Right. So I think other people are trying to ask some questions. So,
okay.
But appreciate the conversation.
May I build up on the previous question? What's your perspective on theorizing without any empirical data? So, what are the chances to develop and publish a completely conceptual paper? So,
I mean, I've made my career on publishing that paper, conceptual only.
Can we do that today?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. I mean, so people will say, is it harder to get a theoretical paper published or an empirical paper published? In my experience is that they're both really hard to do. I mean, the empirical papers are hard and so are theoretical papers. So difficulty is a constant. It's not a variable here. There are some skills you can learn to become better, more effective at writing different kinds of papers, including theoretical papers versus empirical papers. Yeah, I think you can do both of them. Certainly, you know, I'm just not a data guy. I never have been. Well, I was in graduate school, but I repented. Empirical data just seems to me to sometimes just get in the way of the elegance of the theory. I know that's a controversial statement, but yeah. I tell a joke about empirical work, and it is a joke, but it is. So when you write the theory paper and get it published, you know it's right? I mean, it's right. You're confident about it. So when someone does an empirical test of your theory, one of two things can happen. The results can be consistent with your theory, but in that case, you really haven't learned anything since you knew you were already right. Or alternatively, it can generate results that are inconsistent with your theory, in which case it was almost certainly a measurement error. So, you know, so I admire the work that's done and acknowledge its importance, but I don't ever feel constrained by lack of data to write a theory paper.
May I ask a question about the different origins of theories? Because
Sure.
when I read literature, I found that, for example, value capture theory, now they're using the game theory, and it's from the value-based perspective. But when I read the literature about a probability, so how to capture value from innovation, so it's more about the knowledge-based view. So even though these two views are both from the resource-based views, I still found that it's a little bit difficult for me to converge them when I want to write them together.
Well, that's what makes it interesting theory question. So I would take that observation and I would say, okay, under what conditions do these two theories come to similar conclusions? Under what conditions they come to different conclusions? Then you've established the boundary conditions between the two theories. This is one of the things that Rich was just talking about. And a discussion of when those two theories generate similar or different predictions is in fact a theoretical contribution itself. So you just did step one of writing a theory paper. And step two was to answer the question about when these two different theories operate differently.
Thank you.
I have a question. So this is, I learned about Jay's ABCs from Ross, who was my advisor, Ross Koff, on how to on how to write the introduction to papers, and I've generally tried to follow that. But I just literally read your 2018 paper on the AMR on how to do that just when Rich reached out to me and told me about this workshop. So it was very helpful, very practical, because it spelled each one of those steps out really clearly. So I'm wondering, when should we expect the next one on how to write theory and propositions for the next part of the paper? Because it was just really an excellent template to follow. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's very nice of you to say. I don't have the next one. I have a few observations about conclusion sections, discussion section that I share with people. But I actually say, from my experiences, once I get the introduction right, in particular, once I get the research question really well formulated, then writing the rest of the paper is kind of filling in the blanks. I mean, literally, there's a logical flow you have to create. You have to, so this paper I reviewed yesterday, I wrote the letter on it yesterday. I said, so I really like this paragraph because it tells you what you need to do. You need to do this. Point one, you have to make that. Point two, point three, point four, point five. Unfortunately, in the current version of the paper, you don't do any of those things, but at least you now know what you're supposed to do in order to, getting the introduction right, I think, has a huge implication for the rest of the paper. But there's an intuitive part, something I don't think I say in any versions of that essay. I have two versions out. Is a way of thinking about writing theory is to write the paper backwards. And what I mean by that is start with a conclusion you want to make. I want to conclude X. Conclude X is because it will contradict some other ideas, or it will make Rich angry. That's a really good thing to do. I want to end with some controversial or provocative conclusion. And
like
then
Michael
when
Porter
I decide
is wrong.
what Michael Porter is wrong. That's right.
Right. That was the title for a while.
That was the original title of the strategic factor markets paper, was why Michael Porter was wrong. So I want to end there, and then you work backwards. You say, okay, what's a prior step that I need to get here, and what's the next prior step? What's the next prior step? And I want to work back to first principles, so that the first assumptions or definitions you read in the paper are completely innocuous. No one would disagree with these things. So for example, I try to avoid coming up with new definitions. I want to use well-established definitions that are non-controversial. And then my goal in the paper is to take the reader by the hand and walk them step by step as they go through this process of reading my paper. And at the first step, they're comfortable, then they're comfortable, and every step they're comfortable. and then they realize where they're headed, and before it's too late, they end up agreeing with me. So I had someone on my 2018 SMJ paper came up and said, Jay, I really disagree with your conclusion, but I haven't found a way yet to prove you're wrong. So that's exactly the way you should, so to write in the paper backwards. Now, there is a problem with that model, or a challenge with that model, which is, how do you realize it's an interesting conclusion? What is an interesting conclusion theoretically and in the field? And this is essay that Rich has written primarily is helps you do that. It actually says, this is what a contribution looks like, could look like. It could be any of these kinds of contributions. And so that to me was an extremely important addition to the introduction, because I get the intuition, I work backwards, then I write the introduction that has a clear research question that I'm going to answer. It becomes a bit of a package. So I guess another way of saying this is that the next paper is the one in SMJ that Rich is the first author on. I think we should just take one more question, if that's okay.
Can I go
Thanks.
ahead,
Oh, okay. You want to go ahead?
if you don't mind?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Such generosity.
Thank you so much. So my question is this, that if I'm writing a conceptual paper and I am not undertaking a systematic literature review, it's a normal literature review that I'm doing, but I end up finding a pattern in that review, pattern about how the research has been conducted, maybe some ontological difference. So can that be taken ahead as a finding or maybe a contribution of my paper, or will I get review feedback as to go ahead and do a systematic review and then tell me about the pattern? Otherwise, just focus on the conclusion that your conceptual framework is about. What is your views?
Well, so again, this is all heretical. So I actually think systematic literature reviews are usually not that useful, because most of those reviews do a really good job of telling us what exists in the literature. And what you need to do is you need to identify what's something that doesn't exist in the literature, what's missing. So a systematic literature review that does a great job, I call them he said, she said lists. He said this, she said that, he said this, she said that. I'm serious. I could do that in an afternoon with a computer and a good bibliographic database, right? That's not interesting. What's interesting is, don't even tell me about all that stuff, because I know it. Tell me what's missing and why it's important. That's the only purpose of literature review. Well, that's the main purpose of literature review. Now, the way I do literature reviews is, if you look at my papers, I don't have a section called literature review. I may have something called theoretical background, or actually just definitions. And I will review the relevant literature by choosing definitions of terms from that literature so that people will know where I'm coming from and its purpose. But we used to get these at AMR. AMR does not publish literature reviews, but we still get quite a few sent our way, and they were all desk rejected. But they're done very systematically. I mean, here are the 62 journals I'm gonna look at, and I'm gonna look over these 10-year period, and here are the keywords, and yeah, but I just don't ever find that stuff very insightful. It seems to be not the basis of interesting theorizing as much as tell me what's missing. What's the theoretical gap and why is it important? There's lots of gaps in the literature, infinite number of gaps, literally. Of all the gaps you could try to fill, why are you filling this one? And if the answer to that question is, because I did a systematic literature and everyone's talking about everything else except this one point, that's not a good reason. Actually, it turns out there may be a really good reason no one's talked about that point right now, because it's not interesting. It's not theoretically important. So yeah, I'm a little cautious on. I know for doctoral students, you got to know the literature, but there's this two things have to happen simultaneously to be creative in theorizing. You have to know the literature, but you have to be able to ignore the literature at the same time. Because if you can be captured by the literature and be unable to write anything that's new or creative. You know, it's every once in a while. I saw an earlier question where someone said, suppose somebody came up with a theory that said incompetent government action can lead to higher firm performance. So that seems to be counterintuitive, although instantly I can see a logic for why it would make sense, right? I would say, yeah, absolutely. Ask the counterintuitive question and see if you can build a story around that. So the literature review is important, but it's not determinative here by any such admission. There are a bunch of other questions. I wish I could have the time. Oh, see, my burning question, how to take organized notes from all the readings in order to facilitate thoughts for writing. Yeah, but see, the theory is not derived from the readings. That's the thing. This is not about reading a lot and then saying, oh, I get it. No, it's about reading a lot and then transcending what you've read to ask a question. So, well, thank you, Rich, for organizing this, and let me get out of your way now. I want to say, dropping in. I just want to say one other thing. At various times in your career, your incentives as professors will evolve and change, and certainly as young professors, you're focusing on your research and your publications. I totally understand that. But there comes a time in your career when you have to make choices about not abandoning your research efforts, because those will always continue in hopes, but whether you want to augment those narrow interests with a focus on building our community and building the field of strategic management. And it's very gratifying to see someone like Rich, who has very high level of theoretical skill and continues to exercise that skill, but has also now become committed to building the field of strategic management, both through these kinds of efforts. Now he's in his role at AMR. And I just want to thank you, Rich, for setting a correct example for that kind of behavior. So
kind of you, Jay. So kind of you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm delighted that you could be with us here today. I really appreciate you dropping in and taking questions. Maybe staying longer than you intended.
It is, but that's okay. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Jay. Really privileged to see you.
No problem. Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Wow. That was terrific.
Yes, that was. Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting Jay.
Sure.
Those in the chat who don't know who Jay Barney is, probably you subscribe to a wrong gig.
Yeah, you're in the wrong webinar if you don't know who Jay Barney is. That's
yeah,
for sure.
Exactly.
Jay has an amazing 160,000 Google citations on Google Scholar. 160,000 Google Scholar citations. Just amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating and intimidating to see that even Jay Barney is in the R&R process. Right? So what are the chances for us?
Yes, well, it is. It's like he said, every difficulty is a constant, you know, in this business, not a variable, that's for sure.
All right, thank you very much. Shall we go back?
Yeah, let me just, I have just one more slide to get through here. So I'll try to do that quickly. So let me find my notes again. Okay, so the last piece of, and by the way, can everybody see my screen okay? Yeah, well, good. I'm seeing nodding. That's good. Okay. So the last piece of figure 1 is this output at the bottom. So what do we actually do with a theory? What are the outputs? What can it do for us? A theory can have a variety of different kinds of outputs. The most common probably is explanations or predictions. but there's also prescriptions. And so a theory generates an explanation when the existence of observed phenomena can be deduced from the theory's assumptions and propositions. So explanations are usually expressed in the form of propositions or hypotheses. On the other hand, predictions, they kind of have the same logical structure as explanations, except that they involve assertions about some future date. So predictions can also be reflected in a series of propositions or hypotheses. Now, finally, prescriptions point to actions that managers or others can take to have an effect on specific organizational outcomes. So what can we do in order to make a contribution at this phase of the theorizing process, the output phase? Let me see. Okay. So one thing we can do is to just simply derive a new type of output. So when a theory is new, usually the first order of business is to derive some initial outcomes from it. But a theory may not yield up all of its implications at the outset. So there may be important contributions to be made by deriving additional outputs from existing theories. So for, especially by considering different types of outputs. So a theory, for example, might start out as an explanation and then later get used for making predictions or prescriptions. That's kind of a common sort of thing. So deriving a new type of output. And there's important distinctions about what makes any one of these types of outputs good or not, right? A good prediction about what will happen may not be a good explanation of why it happens, or may not be a good basis for a prescription about what should happen. Prediction about what will happen is not a prescription of what you want to happen, right? So in short, these are all kind of different types of outputs that serve different purposes. An explanation, a prediction, and a prescription all are kind of different purposes that are served by them. When a theory's assumptions or boundary conditions are very general, it usually yields only very general outputs. The more specific the boundary conditions or assumptions become, the more specific the outputs can be. Given that generality is usually considered as a virtue in theorizing, the low-hanging fruit is usually picked first, leaving opportunities for researchers to make subsequent contributions by reaching up to the higher branches, in effect, by seeking out interesting special cases where imposing more assumptions or more restrictive boundary conditions can enable the theorist to derive more specific outputs. So, for example, one example we cite in the paper is the 2013 article by Ramon Casadesus-Mazanel and Feng Zhu, where they derive new implications from game theoretic approaches to innovation and competitive dynamics by applying and altering aspects of previous models to the particular special case of sponsor-based business models, right? So by looking at the special case of sponsor-based business models, they're able to derive more specific outputs. And finally, a theory contribution can also be made by combining different theories to derive new outputs from the combination of theories that could not be derived from any one of those theories by itself. A great example of this is Mingzhi Chen's 1996 paper, I think it was an AMR paper, where he derived new predictions by synthesizing theories of competitive dynamics with theories of competitive advantage. So that's about all I've got in terms of walking through figure 1 and the various levers for making a theory contribution. Basically, all we did in that theory, in that figure 1 and in this paper as a whole, is basically say, hey, what are the different parts of a theory? What are the different building blocks of a theory? And how can you make a contribution by altering one of those building blocks at a time, right? You don't need to make a big grand theory contribution by changing everything all at once. It's sufficient to take a look at one of the individual building blocks of a theory or one of the individual components of a theory and make a change there. That's a sufficient theory contribution. You know, you don't have to go all the way towards creating a whole new grand theory where everything is changed all at once. In fact, that probably would be counterproductive because it would be difficult for people to absorb. So, time for questions. And I'm going to rely on Sergey to field the questions and give me the ones that he thinks are most important at first.
I'll do my best. You know, with the number of participants, it's going to be a challenge. So what I would recommend, we had many questions in the chat, but I have a feeling that some of those questions were answered in the chat as well. And some of those questions were answered during the presentation itself and during this short Q&A question with Jay Barney. So if you think that your question hasn't been answered yet, could you please repeat your question in the chat, and we will try to answer that question. Agnieszka, you generously waived your turn.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you kick off the Q&A session now?
Yes, thanks a lot, Sergey. Richard, thanks a lot for invitation to join. It's been really, really interesting session. And I think also very, very important, not only for PhD students and junior scholars, but I think that these kind of discussions, it should be something we should discuss basically every day during a lunch break. And how do we progress with our theoretical contributions and challenges and so on. So I would like to pick up on this learning process, right? So you talk a lot about different types of theoretical contributions and how we could make them, how to approach it for like many different angles. I was wondering about one of the angles that you didn't tell us yet about, and this is this Bridge Reviewers program that AMR is offering. Could you tell us a little bit more? And then also, when do you think we should start joining? I mean, I'm not talking about joining as like a full-fledged regular reviewer, but even like a bridge program, because I have a feeling that we need to have some sort of a preparation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right, okay, so yes, so thank you for the question. You know, this is a workshop on theory development, and AMR, of course, is probably the premier theory journal in the field. And so it is a place where we try to develop new theorists. I recently took on the role of associate editor at AMR, and I should acknowledge Sherry Thatcher, the great editor-in-chief, for picking me. I appreciate her trusting me with this role. And so, you know, AMR has prided itself over many years with its developmental mission. You know, we have, AMR has an award for reviewers in terms of providing the most developmental feedback for authors. And it is a, you know, it is a criterion. I'm asked to rate every review in terms of how developmental it is, every review I receive. And every decision letter that I write is expected to be highly developmental. And for that reason, I think the last decision letter I wrote was something like 4 or 5 pages long, going into the details of all the different improvements that the authors could make to their paper. So, we definitely want to help develop future theorists, and reviewing is definitely part of that. It's an important way to kind of get tapped into what's going on in theory by, you know, by reading and commenting on early stage theoretical work that other people have done, and it's a great way of giving back to the field. So AMR has developed this bridge reviewer program for people who have not previously been reviewers for AMR. It involves some training and some mentorship. As a bridge reviewer, we try to find, I try to find a bridge reviewer for every manuscript that I send out for review. And the editor in those cases has the option of including the bridge reviewer's review in the feedback to the authors or not. And there's follow-up. And let me see. So we have some documents about the bridge reviewer program that I do not have right at my fingertips at the moment. But maybe when the breakout rooms occur and I have a little chance to search through my hard disk, I can find those documents and post them here. So thank you.
Just put it into the chat. But
yeah,
I'll put it into the, no, someone just put it.
Chat. Right, when I when I can have a chance to look. But let me give somebody else a chance to ask some more questions first. Oh, did I turn off my screen share? I hope I did.
Richard, there was a question about your perspective on using more than one building block, and there was a question from Nina Tang around this. Nina, can you unmute yourself and expand a little bit on your question from about different disciplines and Nina? I cannot see Nina on the screen.
Sorry, I had some internet.
Ah, there she is.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks so much for organizing this. This has been really helpful. I just have a question, a specific one on the why questions regarding the mechanisms. So you give the example of how there's different mechanisms from different disciplines. If we're focusing on one audience, do we need to stick to one set of mechanisms, or when we're, especially in the literature review, when we're trying to explain the gap in theory, do we need to address the other disciplines' view of the mechanism we're talking about?
Well, are you aiming to publish it in a discipline journal, or are you aiming to publish in a management journal?
Management journal.
Yeah, so I think, management draws from the base social science disciplines of psychology, sociology, economics, and others, sometimes political science. But at least my understanding of the management field, and especially the strategic management field, is that we're open to thinking about causal mechanisms from any of these places, right? That the strategy field defines its mandate, its mission, its boundaries in terms of thinking about the factors that contribute to overall organizational performance, with a recognition that those factors can come from a variety of disciplinary sources. So I think in management journals, I would say it's fine to blend mechanisms from different disciplinary sources, but with the caution that you have to be careful to make sure that you don't have inconsistencies, right, between those different sources, right? So one of the points that I made with regard to boundary conditions was that sometimes different theories can have assumptions that are inconsistent with each other, right? So the assumptions, for example, in an economic theory, usually rely on some level of rationality, right? Whereas the assumptions in maybe more psychodynamic theories really would regard that the assumption of rationality with as maybe amusing at best, as not realistic. So if you're blending theories from different disciplines that make conflicting assumptions, that's where you have to be careful, right? But as long as the assumptions underlying the causal mechanisms are not, overtly conflicting, I don't see any necessary reason why you can't blend them. I hope that helps.
That helps. Thank you.
There was a question from Ahmad Al-Harabi about construct and variables. Ahmad, would you like to unmute yourself and explain a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is just about the construct and variables, making construct and variables relying on qualitative study. I mean, how can that be done? I mean, doing it in deductive way, kind of straightforward, but doing it in qualitative, is that considered as a theoretical contribution as well?
Sure, why not? I mean, actually, I think inductive research is probably where new constructs are most likely to show up, right? Where you've actually, you've spent some time in the real world with real managers and real organizations, and you've observed, something that the theory doesn't include, right? And so that can become the basis of a new construct. What was it? Was it from Hamlet? The quote, "There's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy." I think, I think that's the point, right? We've got to get outside of our little philosophical frame to see things that are not included in our frame, right? So once we, get out into the world and see those things, we can bring them back into the frame. So yeah, I think that's an excellent way to contribute to theory, by finding constructs that have not previously been considered, within theory, and base those on observations of what's going on in real world phenomena.
All right, thank you so much.
Great. A small announcement. I think we need to be conscious of time, so we will need to move to the third part of our event.
Okay.
We will have a break in between the second and third part. So very soon, those who are taking part in the third part, you'll see an invitation to go to a breakout room. Please ignore that invitation for a while, and later on, I will say you when to press that button. So now.
So sorry, Sergey, if we don't have time for more questions, let me just invite everybody, if you want to follow up with me offline afterwards about questions that we did not have time to answer, please feel free to do so on the handout that I distributed, and it has my my LinkedIn and my email and all that. So feel free to contact me directly offline with any questions that we didn't have a chance to answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard. That's really generous. We know how busy you are, and answering each and every question, it's out of this world. I think we have one more interesting question. So, out of those building blocks that you explained, which one would you say is easiest? The pragmatic. And which one would you say is the most interesting? All right. So if you choose only one.
Gee, that's a good one. Well, what's easiest for me is not necessarily easiest for other people, right? So I've got kind of a different skill set. I'm more of a puzzle solver kind of person. That's part of why I do formal theory. So for me, changing the mode of theorizing from informal to formal, or combining multiple causal mechanisms in a formal model, or deriving additional outputs by combining theories. Those things are kind of those are the easier things for me, just because of my skill set. But what will be easier for you probably is different. It probably will depend upon your skill sets, right? So you might find it easier just to come up with new research questions, or to translate theoretical insights from one level of analysis to another, or something like that. So I can't really speak to what's going to be easy for each individual person. It's a skill-based thing. What's most important was the second part of the question. What kind of contributions are most important? Gee, I don't know about that either. I would say, you know, because what do we mean by important? Important could be in terms of generating new insights, or in terms of generating new practice for managers, right? New things that managers actually do differently, or it could be important in terms of generating lots of new empirical research, right? So there's different types of importance. So I'm not really sure I can answer that. What I would say is the kind of contribution that's most central is a causal mechanism lever, right? If you're doing something with the underlying causal mechanism, you know, that's driving the whole theory, then that's very central. Now, whether it being central makes it important or not, whether there's a correlation between centrality of the contribution and the importance of the contribution, I don't know. Right, but that's how I would think about it.
That's great. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. A great presentation and just exciting Q&A session. Shall we say thank you to Richard for this insightful webinar, and those who don't stay with us on the third part can drop off, and those who are with us on the third part, we will have a comfort break and resume. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you for spending a couple hours of your day with us. I appreciate it.